and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 13, Bitter Herbs. So we left off last time with the Arab armies humiliated by Suluk Khan in the Battle of the Defile. Following this great defeat, Umayyad rule across the Amudarya became basically untenable. All of Transoxiana was now, effectively, the domain of Suluk Khan, Abu Muzahim, the father of the fight. And today, we will close out Suluk's story and discuss how he would come to take the fight to the Umayyad Caliphate with the aid of the Arab revolutionary Harith ibn Surayj, which, though unsuccessful, would ultimately lay the ground for the coming Abbasid revolution. Now, though the Arab sources try to dress it up as a victory, the Battle of the Defile in 731 was at best a Pyrrhic victory, and most certainly a strategic defeat. The Umayyad army had merely escaped annihilation and made it to the safety of Samarkand, but it was now a shadow of its former self. It had limped into the city, almost broken. It would not be able to operate for a long time. Suluk knew that the Arabs were in a precarious position and were now unable to ride out to meet him in the field. They could only cower behind the walls of Samarkand. And so he took advantage of this and left from Samarkand to Bukhara, where he put the city under siege within a month of the Battle of the Defile. Suluk knew that there was no way that the Arabs had the forces to hold both Samarkand and Bukhara. If al-Junayd's army stayed in Samarkand, he would take Bukhara. If they moved off to Bukhara, then they would have to give up Samarkand. Suluk was essentially giving al-Junayd a choice. Which city do you want to keep? You can't have both. He knew that in all likelihood, al-Junayd would choose to relieve Bukhara. It was so much closer to his home base in Khorasan. And if Bukhara fell, what was the point of having Samarkand anyway? There was no way for the Arabs to hold it without also having Bukhara. And in any event, the Arab army was surely too weak to leave Samarkand at the moment and try to relieve Bukhara even if it wanted to. Al-Junayd, for his part, knew what a catastrophe the Battle of the Defile was. He knew he couldn't leave Samarkand with his army in this state. How long could he even stay here? His overall goal of reasserting Arab rule north of the Amudarya was in tatters. How could he rule a land he could barely survive entering? This was now the land of Abu Muzahim, the father of the fight. And so, after letting his army recover in Samarkand for several months, al-Junayd assembled them again and told them that they were going back to Khorasan. They would march back to Bukhara, relieve it from the Türgesh siege, and then cross the river back home. Only 800 men, 400 cavalry and 400 infantry, would remain behind in Samarkand. These 800 men, of course, had no real hope to hold the city when Suluk and the Türgesh returned. I would definitely not have envied being one of those 800, and I would have certainly begun thinking immediately, how do I get myself out of here? Al-Junayd's army left Samarkand and dejectedly marched back to Bukhara, this time along the old Persian royal road. As they approached Bukhara, they again met the forces of Suluk Khan. Suluk knew that while he could besiege Bukhara, he could not really maintain the siege and defeat an Arab army in the field at the same time. But he also knew that al-Junayd would rather have Bukhara than Samarkand. Clearly, al-Junayd had made his choice. As soon as his scouts had sighted the returning army of al-Junayd, Suluk broke off the siege of Bukhara. The Türgesh army again began to harry the Arabs, but their goal was not the complete destruction of the Arab armies. Likely Suluk wanted to conserve his forces and save them for the conquest of Samarkand. So his forces only harassed the rear guard of the Arab armies, sniping at them and launching hit-and-run attacks. Al-Junayd responded by keeping to the high ground, slowly marching the army along the hills above the royal road itself, carefully making his way back to Bukhara. Al-Tabari says that the Turks fought only a little and then retreated. And so al-Junayd's forces limped into Bukhara on the holiday of Mihrigan in 731, one of the holiest days of the Zoroastrian religion. They were thoroughly chastened. Within months, the Arab garrison even here would be driven out, as al-Junayd retreated back across the river to Khorasan. For his part, Suluk was now able to turn back to Samarkand. We don't have good records, but it is clear that the 800 Arab soldiers left in the city were no match for the Turks. Their fate is unknown, but as no siege is recorded, it is likely that these 800 men either surrendered or escaped. Thus King Gurak marched back into Samarkand and regained his throne with Suluk's support. He was now a vassal of the Türgesh. With the restoration of Türgesh hegemony over the kingdom of Samarkand, virtually all of Sogdiana was now in the hands of the father of the fight. Victorious on the battlefield, and with his hegemony over Transoxiana secured, Suluk Khan now pondered his next steps. Clearly the Arabs would be back, and he would need to face them again, but he had also spent a long time in his western lands. To the east, the Tang still ruled in the Tarim Basin on the other side of the Tian Shan and the Pamir Mountains, and Suluk had begun hearing new reports of Tang insolence as he was preoccupied fighting the Arabs. At some point, he would have to ride back to the east to remind them that just because the Khan was in Sogdiana does not mean that he was gone. Additionally, as we discussed all the way back in episode 8, it was around this time that, in the east, the Second Khanate began falling apart. In 731, the great military leader Kul Tegin died, and his politician brother Bilge Khan was left facing increasing revolts alone. Suluk wanted to see if he could perhaps capitalize on this weakness, and he needed to make his presence felt on the steppes to the north and the east to ensure that these rebellions would not spread to his Khanate. But at the same time, Suluk was hesitant to leave his newly conquered lands. He knew that his rule in Transoxiana was not ironclad. He had only just driven the Arabs out, and many of his new vassals had previously been vassals of the Umayyads. King Gurak, for example, had previously been the Arabs' foremost ally in the region. His new vassals needed to be kept on side for his rule to last here, and that meant using both the carrot and the stick. Now the stick his new vassals knew well enough. They had seen how he had campaigned against the Arabs, and no doubt they knew the terrible consequences that they would face if they rebelled. But Suluk also had to show them that there were benefits to Turkish rule. Now part of this was just maintaining law and order and keeping the Silk Road safe and open for trade that would really benefit the elites of these cities. But Suluk wanted to reduce the tensions that inevitably arose between the steppe tribes and the settled peoples they ruled over. And so he instituted a new reform, one never before seen on the steppe. He began paying his armies salaries. Typically, steppe tribes fought for plunder. They would raid the settled peoples and defeat their enemies in battle, whereupon they would enslave them and take their stuff. The Khan would of course impose formal tribute obligations on his vassals, but the tribes themselves would also just sort of show up and demand payment. They would extort the Khan's vassals in times of peace and in times of war. This was of course deeply resented by the settled vassals. Large-scale looting in his newly reconquered territories would inflame the Sogdians against him. Suluk's new rule was that instead of being given license to raid, with the Khan then dividing up the booty among the tribes, his soldiers would instead receive regular payments in silk directly from the Khan as a salary. He likely got the idea of this from the Umayyads, who paid their soldiers this way. These silk payments in turn would be provided by the Sogdian city-states to the Khan as a form of regular taxation. In this way, there would not be plundering of his new vassals. Additionally, this would entrench Suluk's control over the tribes. As the saying goes, he who controls the purse strings commands the future. By centralizing revenues into his hands and then regularly doling out salaries, Suluk was trying to bind both his soldiers and the Sogdian elites more tightly to him and to further centralize the Türgesh Khanate. But this new system was deeply resented by the tribes, and like so many innovative steppe rulers before and after him, think of Anagui Khan and Duobi, who we've discussed before, Suluk would ultimately pay a steep price for these innovations. So with this salary system in place, with the Arabs chastened, for now, Suluk turned back to the east to face the Tang and the Second Khanate. He traveled back to the Türgesh Khanate's heartlands in today's Kyrgyzstan around the city of Suyab. As Suluk returned north in 732, Bilge Khan was able to stabilize the Second Khanate for a time following Kultegin's death, having put down most rebellions by 733. So Suluk sent messengers off to his old Tibetan allies and to Bilge Khan, secured on the throne of the Second Khanate for now. Suluk negotiated new marriage alliances with both the royal court of Tibet and the court of Bilge Khan. Remember, as we discussed in episode 11 when we introduced him, Suluk was not a blue blood. He came from, at best, a low-ranking noble lineage. So marriages into the vaunted Ashina clan of the Second Khanate and the royal house of Tibet were critical for him to legitimize himself. It is likely around this time that Suluk appointed his son as a second Yabgu, alongside his relative Kulchor, who was a key leader among the Black Türgesh. Suluk intended to cement his young dynasty's control over the Khanate, both through marriages and through the appointments of his relatives. With the steppe secure, with his alliance with Tibet and the Second Khanate in place, Suluk Khan began preparing for an attack on Tang China, because nothing legitimizes a Khan quite like defeating a Chinese emperor. In the winter of 734, Suluk began launching raids across the Tarim Basin against Tang forces. These raids continued through 735, growing in intensity. But their purpose was not just to spook the Tang in and of themselves. It was to weaken and disrupt Tang defenses in preparation for a massive attack that Suluk had prepared for the winter of 735. Remember that the steppe warriors did not mind fighting in the winter, unlike settled warriors, and Suluk needed every advantage he could get. His plan was to attack and capture the city of Beshbaluk, the same Tang garrison city that the Second Khanate under Kapagan Khan had failed in capturing 12 years earlier, as we discussed all the way back in episode 8. Beshbaluk, which means 5 fish in Turkish actually, lies near the city of Urumqi in modern-day Xinjiang province in western China. It commanded the gap between the Altai and Tian Shan mountain ranges and guarded a crucial pass into the Tarim Basin. It was therefore heavily fortified. Suluk hoped to succeed where Kapagan Khan and the Second Khanate had failed, and thus dominate the Tarim Basin. But this was still very risky. Beshbaluk was heavily defended, and even after his attacks to soften up the Tang defenses, and even with attacking in winter, there could be no assurance that this would work. As the snow fell, Suluk Khan launched wave after wave of his forces against the walls of the city, hoping to overpower the garrison, but to no avail. His armies were beaten back and settled in for a months-long siege. Successive assaults would not bring the garrison down. Winter turned to spring, and spring turned to summer as the siege dragged on and on. Suluk grew increasingly desperate. In late summer, he ordered another great assault, which again was beaten back in hard and bloody fighting. In this assault, Suluk's own son, his newly appointed Yabgu, died. As he grieved, Suluk had to recognize reality. Victory over the Tang was not possible. He reached out to the commander of the garrison and sued for peace. While he was able to salvage some honor in negotiating a peace treaty, Suluk's reputation and prestige had taken a great hit with this failure to defeat the Tang. And that's always very risky for a steppe warlord who depends on his reputation to control the tribes beneath him and remain alive and on the throne. And now his own son, his planned future successor, lay dead. It must have been with a heavy heart that he marched back west to the Türgesh heartlands around the semi-capital of Suyab. Suluk's position was greatly weakened. His failure in war had opened him up to criticism, particularly over the resented new army salary system. But as he was nursing his wounds in 736 following his failure to defeat the Tang, Suluk received both an Arab political refugee and a message from a lord of Khutal, that land of northern Afghanistan, begging for aid against the Arabs, who were again rising in force. So what had the Arabs been up to while Suluk was focused on the east? After the disaster of the Battle of the Defile and his forced retreat back across the river, al-Junayd sent urgent messengers off to Damascus to inform the Caliph of the great defeat and to tell him that large reinforcements were absolutely necessary. Indeed, the Umayyads would need reinforcements just to stop Suluk from crossing the river and invading deep into Khorasan and Balkh. The Khorasani settler Arabs had been absolutely decimated by Suluk. After years of fighting the father of the fight, the Umayyads had lost thousands and thousands of men. The historical record even shows that many Khorasani Arab tribal names never again appear in the sources after the Battle of the Defile. So high were the casualties that entire families were exterminated by the Turks. And so the Caliph sent 20,000 Iraqi troops to Khorasan to support al-Junayd and the Arab forces and to defeat Suluk Khan. And later, tens and tens of thousands of additional Syrian troops would be sent to Khorasan. But the introduction of these new Arab forces would come to destabilize the situation in Khorasan and in the east of the Umayyad domains. And this destabilization would eventually lead to the very fall of the Umayyad Caliphate itself. Now we're going to get into the details of the deteriorating political situation in Khorasan and in the eastern lands of the Caliphate next episode. But for now, all you need to know is that the arrival of these Iraqi and Syrian troops caused massive tensions with the existing Khorasani Arab settler population. The Arabs who had settled in Khorasan were largely poorer and lower ranked than the Arabs who had settled in Syria and Iraq. They already had a very, very fraught relationship with the Umayyad state as well, whereas the Syrian Arabs in particular were very strong supporters of the Umayyads. So the arrival of these new troops inflamed an already tense situation. And these tensions were harnessed by that guy I told you not to forget last time, Harith ibn Surayj. Now, Harith first appeared as a commander in the Battle of Baikant, assisting al-Junayd in fighting Suluk Khan. He next appears in the historical record as a revolutionary. Harith, after retiring from the armies, came to believe, like the coming Abbasids, that the division between Arab and non-Arab was immaterial. All that it took to be a Muslim was belief. You didn't have to speak Arabic. You didn't need to be sponsored into the religion by some governor or some general. You didn't even need to really have any great knowledge of the Quran or the Sunnah, that is the way of the Prophet. All you needed to do was recite the Shahada and believe in its words, that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And because of this, all Muslims, whether Arab or not, were equal, and they should all therefore have equal rights. Now, as we will discuss in more detail in the next episode, Harith's message was uniquely suited to the eastern lands of the Caliphate where he had settled, and he skillfully used the resentment of the local population, Arab and non-Arab alike, to harness support for his new message. Harith began preaching throughout Khorasan and Balkh in the early 730s, slowly gathering supporters. His message spread quickly across Khorasan and Balkh, among the frontier Arabs and the non-Arab converts, the Mawali, both of whom were bitterly resentful at the Umayyads and the newcomers brought in to fight the Turks. In 733, Harith led a protest in Tokharistan, modern-day northern Afghanistan, against the confiscation of goods in order to feed the new arrivals and al-Junayd's court in Marv. He was brutally flogged for this, but his reputation grew among the frontier people. Soon he raised the flag of revolt, choosing the black banner of the early Muslims as his symbol. But for now, his revolt remains small, a tiny band of irregular troops and militia forces, mostly of Mawali converts, always on the move, and he did not yet pose a threat to al-Junayd or to the Umayyad state. But then, in 734, al-Junayd died in Khorasan of natural causes. News of his death spread across Khorasan and Balkh, eventually reaching the Arab garrison in Guzgan, one of the smallest and most remote Arab garrisons in Tokharistan, and a garrison manned entirely by frontier Arabs and Mawali troops. Upon hearing the news, the Guzgan garrison joined with Harith. This gave Harith much-needed professional soldiers, and Harith quickly came to Guzgan to lead the revolution. At this point, al-Junayd's successor, Asim ibn Abdullah al-Hilali, arrived from Iraq to the court in Marv to take up his position. As the revolution spread, Asim realized that he was outgunned here, and he decided to negotiate. He sent emissaries to al-Harith, but al-Harith imprisoned them. The revolt spread as more and more garrisons began to defect to al-Harith. Then the local non-Muslim princes in Afghanistan joined the revolt. Within a year, al-Harith was commanding a mighty army. He sent this army against Balkh, the capital of Tocharistan, while the local commander, a guy we'll discuss in detail next episode, was an Iraqi Arab loyal to the Umayyads. His troops were largely frontier Arabs and Mawali, and they put up no resistance to al-Harith. The capital city of Balkh fell to al-Harith and the commander fled. Al-Harith now attempted to take Marv, the capital of Khorasan and the seat of the Umayyad governor. As he approached the city, Mawali, frontier Arabs, and even non-Muslims flocked to his black banners. His army swelled to over 60,000 strong. The governor Asim commanded a much smaller force, but was able to defeat al-Harith by cleverly destroying the bridges over a strategic canal. With no way to advance, al-Harith's army began melting away, and he was forced to retreat. But Asim's position was still perilous, and he was forced to come to a peace treaty with al-Harith, according to some sources, even agreeing to join him in revolt should the caliph not accept al-Harith's reforms. This infuriated the caliph back in Damascus, and Asim was removed from power, and his brother Asad was appointed to replace him. Asad arrived with 20,000 more Syrian troops to crush al-Harith's rebellion. The resulting war was vicious. Asad's forces moved across Tocharistan, laying waste to the land. And like happens oh so often in civil wars, one of the combatants began looking for outside help as the situation deteriorated. In desperation, al-Harith reached out to the Lord of Khutal, a Sogdian kingdom just to the north of the river that was a vassal of the Türgesh. As we discussed all the way back in episode 11, it was the kingdom of Khutal that first called on Suluk for aid, which ultimately led to the Türgesh invasion and the Day of Thirst. Now the kingdom of Khutal of course agreed, lending al-Harith much-needed troops and supplies. Now we don't need to get into the details, but Asad's forces were just way too strong, and the hard fighting was eroding al-Harith's support both among the Khorasani Arabs and the Mawali. After a serious defeat at a river crossing on the Amu Darya, al-Harith's rebellion was broken, and by 736 Asad was victorious. The first spark of revolution against Umayyad power had been snuffed out. As we will see, it would not be the last fire to start in the east. Al-Harith was now a wanted man on the run, and he fled north across the Amu Darya to the strongest leader he could possibly find to assist him. He fled to Suluk Khan, Abu Muzahim, the father of the fight. At the same time, Asad decided that he had to punish Khutal for its disobedience and for aiding al-Harith, so he prepared for a massive invasion in 737 to bring the wayward infidels to justice. The Arab warriors began amassing on the Amu Darya, crossing the river to teach the kingdom of Khutal a lesson. And it was in response to this that, as we discussed earlier in the episode, the Lord of Khutal sent messengers north to Suluk Khan. Suluk was at this time camping with his main herds near the semi-capital of the Türgesh at Suyab. According to al-Tabari, he was in a mountain valley where he was constantly drilling his troops, preparing them for war. It was to this valley that both al-Harith and the embassy of Khutal frantically arrived. Suluk now had both al-Harith and the envoys of Khutal begging him to march south to confront the Arabs once again. This was a tempting proposal, especially as his defeat at the hands of the Tang had weakened his authority, and his new salary system was deeply unpopular. And there is nothing quite like a successful war to steady the position of a faltering Khan. Additionally, Suluk saw that in the 6 years since his victory in Samarkand at the Battle of the Defile, the Arab position had again been strengthened. At least 40,000 new troops had been sent from Iraq and Syria, and the new Arab commanders were again crossing the Amu Darya. It was time for him to return and to teach them a lesson. It was time for the father of the fight to again bring the fight to the Arabs. And so, in September 737, Suluk assembled a horde of about 50,000 men and began marching south towards Khutal with the utmost haste. According to al-Tabari, the Khan called for a saddled bridled horse and commanded that a ewe be cut up and hung by leather straps. Then he took some salt, putting it in a bag and attaching it to his belt, and he commanded each Turk to do likewise, saying, "This is your ration until you meet the Arabs in Khutal." Thus motivated, the Turkish army assembled and quickly began riding south through the mountain passes, intending to arrive in Khutal from the north. Meanwhile, the Arabs had crossed the river and invaded Khutal from the south. But the Arabs were not just invading to teach Khutal a lesson. They had an additional economic motivation. Remember that Khutal, like the rest of the city-states and petty kingdoms of the region, was a crucial link on the Silk Road. The Arabs, hoping to cut Suluk and his vassals out of the Silk Road trade, were escorting a large baggage train of immensely valuable goods destined for China. They hoped that they could conquer Khutal and then see the baggage train off to the Tang outposts of the Tarim Basin. And it was this baggage train that would give the coming battle its name, the Battle of the Baggage. As the Arabs invaded Khutal, they fanned out across the countryside, plundering and marauding. They were therefore dispersed as Suluk and the Türgesh army rapidly advanced towards Khutal. But upon seeing the sheer numbers and the might of the Arab troops he was facing, and seeing them ravage his country, the Lord of Khutal decided to hedge his bets. He realized that there was a decent chance the Arabs were actually going to win this thing, so he decided to inform Asad that Suluk was coming. He also hoped that by informing Asad of Suluk's movements, Asad would have to reconsolidate his forces to fight the Turks, which would necessitate stopping the plundering of his kingdom, as the Arab troops had to form up to face the Turks. So he wrote to Asad, saying, "Depart from Khutal, for the Khan has cast his shadow over you." Asad at first did not believe this message from the Lord of Khutal, but the Lord of Khutal pleaded with Asad, telling him that it was he himself who had called in Suluk Khan in response to the Arab invasion. He said, "The Arabs have been ever hostile to me for as long as I have been surviving, but the Khan has overwhelmed me. His weight has become severe, and he holds me in his obligation by saying to me, 'I have expelled the Arabs from your country and returned your rule to you.'" Thus convinced that Suluk was coming, Asad then decided that he had to order the valuable baggage train of goods, now additionally laden with plunder and loot from Khutal, back across the river and away from the coming Turkish advance. Asad then recalled his troops from plundering and began to form them up to the north of the river to face the might of the incoming Turks. Meanwhile, the Türgesh army began to emerge from the mountain passes. The Turks had made the ride to Khutal in record time, traversing the astounding distance of roughly 800 kilometers in only 18 days. Suluk had marched his army hard through the mountains, pushing them to move as fast as humanly possible. And his speed seems to have worked. Though the sources are a bit muddled, it appears that the Arab army was not able to form up in time. Having been dispersed throughout the land to plunder and raid, they were still in a disorganized state when the terrifying news reached them. Suluk Khan, the father of the fight, was upon them. So fearsome was the reputation of Suluk Khan and the Türgesh that the Arab forces broke and began to flee towards the river before the Turks even had a chance to bring them to battle. Asad, seeing his forces melting away and seeing Suluk Khan appearing from over the horizon with his vast horde, knew that he could not stay and fight. And so he hastily ordered a retreat. The Arabs fled for their lives, making for the river as fast as they could. Asad tried to control this retreat to stop it from turning into a rout, but order quickly broke down. He was also concerned that the remaining baggage of the army and its provisions be transported across the river. He did not want to be stuck without provisions. So as his men fled in terror, Asad tried to order them to each at least carry one sheep across the river so that the army would at least have food on the far side, even trying to stop men not carrying sheep from crossing the river. Now their commander's focus on carrying sheep across the river was really not appreciated by men fleeing for their lives, one of whom reportedly screamed at Asad, You have scattered the men and diverted their attention while the enemy has cast his shadow over you. Put these sheep aside, may God's curse be upon them, and command the men to make ready for battle." But weird obsession with transporting sheep aside, Asad was still a pretty solid commander, and he knew that his army was in no position to hold off the Turks. Instead, he ordered 2 of his best contingents to act as a rearguard and cover the retreat of the rest of his army, which was increasingly becoming disordered. But the rearguard could not hold the crossing. As al-Tabari reports, Asad rode into the river, commanding that the camels be brought across to the Transoxianian side so they could be loaded up with heavy baggage. A dust cloud appeared from Qutal, which was the Khan. When a major part of his troops had fully come up with him, he attacked the rearguard, who retreated. Asad galloped until he reached his camp. Asad was even forced to order that his beloved sheep be cast aside into the river in order for his men to cross. Al-Tabari relates, "It is said that when the foreparts of the horses' hooves dug into the riverbed, it became mucky. Some of the horsemen were tipping to the side and falling off their mounts. Therefore Asad commanded that the sheep be thrown away, and his men forded. They had not finished the crossing when the Turks came up against them en masse, killing those who had not crossed. The men began charging into the river to escape." The Arab army had been driven from Qutal in chaos. But while they had suffered some losses and the retreat had been chaotic, the army was still mostly intact, and they still had the immensely valuable baggage train full of goods destined for China. Knowing that the river was wild and difficult to forge, as he had just experienced, Asad determined that Suluk Khan and the Turks would not be able to cross it. He therefore decided to make a camp near the river to regroup his forces and consider their next actions. On the other side of the river, Suluk Khan surveyed the scene. His troops had driven the Arabs from the field by virtue of their reputation alone. They hadn't even needed to fight the Arab army in order to break it. And in their chaotic rout, the Arabs had lost many men and a large portion of their supplies. Suluk knew that the Arabs were not expecting him to cross the river, which had long been the dividing line between their realms. But as he eyed the far bank, he wondered if he could in fact press his advantage. So he sent out a Sogdian commander from his court to race up the river to discover if any of the locals knew of a fording place. After hearing repeatedly that there was no place for the army to cross, finally one local Sogdian lord reported that there was in fact a nearby place where the Turkish army could make it across. So Suluk rallied his troops and traveled to this ford, swiftly moving his army across the river undetected by the Arabs who were still regrouping. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Suluk and his army appeared and charged the Arab encampment. The Arabs were able to beat off this attack by retreating into their encampment and deploying a spear wall, which charging horses could not attack. There, they hunkered down for the night. But Suluk was not primarily interested in Asad's weakened army. He had his sights set on a far greater prize, the rich baggage train, full of plunder of Qutal and the luxurious goods bound for China. And so, in the middle of the night, as Asad's troops fitfully waited for dawn and a fresh Turkish charge, Suluk quietly pulled his troops away from the encampment and made for the now undefended baggage train. As dawn broke, the Turks charged the baggage train. Caught completely unawares, the Arab defenders put up a brave fight and were able to hold off the initial charge. Thereupon Suluk rode forward to the front lines, climbing up a hill to oversee and direct the battle himself. Suluk ordered waves of attack, and the Arab troops guarding the vast wealth of the baggage train were annihilated, along with most of their Sogdian and Iranian allies. At this point, Asad's army finally caught up with Suluk and the Turks. He strode up to the very hill from which Suluk had commanded his troops, but Asad saw clearly that there was nothing he could do. The battle was lost, and his troops were in no position now to challenge the Turks. The Turks had captured the immensely wealthy baggage train and now left the battlefield laden with their plunder. In the words of al-Tabari, the Khan moved on, leading the prisoners from Asad's troops in nooses and driving the camels laden with spoils and slave girls. Suluk, as he led his troops away laden with plunder, decided to send a message to Asad. As he did not know Arabic, he sent one of the companions of al-Harith who was with him to Asad to deliver a message. the messenger galloped to within earshot of Asad and screamed out Suluk's boast. "O Asad, is not that which you had in Transoxiana now a seat of war? You are most certainly extremely greedy. You were driven from Khutal, which is the land of my fathers and forefathers." The Battle of the Baggage was one of Suluk's greatest victories. Firstly, it allowed him to re-establish his position among the tribes after his embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Tang. But it was also his first great victory on the other side of the Amudarya. One Turkish noble reportedly said, "I have not seen a day better than the day of the heavy baggage. I gained great wealth, and did not see an enemy fouler than the Arab prisoners." It was absolutely critical to Suluk that he shore up his weakening support among people like that. But it also demonstrated to the Arabs that the Great River was not the wall that they thought it was. And perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated to those local lords in Balkh, Khorasan, and Tokharistan, the Sogdians and the Bactrians and other Iranic peoples who had submitted to the Arabs, that the Arabs could be defeated on their side of the river. It was a powerful sign and a hope to the non-Muslim local rulers. Perhaps the Arabs could be gotten rid of. The Battle of the Baggage also weakened Asad. Remember, Asad had been appointed and sent to the east along with Syrian troops who were loyal to the Umayyad cause. Well, now a lot of them lay dead. This weakened Umayyad control over the Khorasani Arabs, those frontier Arabs who did not like the Umayyad state. And as we will come to see next time, this will have devastating consequences. And of course, Asad's reputation took a major hit, which in such a religious time and place always implied divine disfavor. Reportedly, as he slunk back to the city of Balkh after the Battle of the Baggage to prepare for the winter, he was reproached. "From Khutal you have come, with a destroyed face you have come, a fugitive you have come back, lowly and emaciated you have come back." Above all, Arab rule on the other side of the Amudarya, in Transoxiana, was now broken. There was simply no way for the Arabs to cross the river under arms and enforce their will. Suluk, for his part, returned north of the river to camp his troops in Khutal, no doubt having some harsh words to share with its duplicitous king, who had informed Asad of his coming. He was soon joined by al-Harith, who had taken a slower route and therefore missed the battle. There, Suluk consulted with al-Harith and a flood of recently arrived messengers of the Sogdian city-states and other Iranic rulers from Transoxiana, Balkh, and Tokharistan. See, as the news of the Battle of the Baggage spread across Central Asia, the local Sogdian city-states turned to Suluk. Even south of the river, in Balkh, the local Iranic rulers and elites sent messengers to the Khan. All came bearing the same message. "We are with you. Now is the time." All of these rulers saw that this was their chance, maybe their last chance, to rid themselves of the Arabs. Al-Harith, for his part, hoped to harness the power of Suluk Khan and the Türgesh to completely defeat Asad and the Umayyad forces in the region. With them gone, he believed that he could again raise up a force of local Muslims and turn it inwards, towards the faraway lands of Iraq and Syria, and topple the Umayyad Caliphate, those apostates in Damascus who he had come to believe were perverting the faith of the messenger. Al-Harith advised Suluk that the Arabs would not be able to campaign in the winter, and therefore, if the Turks struck quickly, as the Arabs were in winter quarters, they would be able to overwhelm them. Suluk knew that the Turks would be the superior force in the winter. As we have discussed before, unlike settled peoples, Central Asian nomads really did not mind campaigning in winter, and in fact preferred it in some ways. Additionally, Suluk believed he had to keep up the pressure. If he let up after this victory, then the same thing would happen as had happened after his victory at the Battle of the Defile 6 years earlier. Eventually, the Arabs would regroup, regather their strength, and then attempt to cross the river again. And Suluk had begun to entertain other thoughts. He spent long nights deep in conversation with al-Harith, and he had become convinced that the Umayyad state was faltering. An idea had formed in his mind. Throughout his long war with them, he had become convinced that the Arabs were never as strong as their reputation, never as strong as they were seen to be by others. But he knew the truth, confirmed by his long discussions with al-Harith. The Arabs were weak and divided and could be beaten. Not only could he stop them from crossing the river, maybe he could destroy their entire state. He could drive them not only back across the river, but from Balkh, from Khorasan, from Iran. Who knew? Perhaps he could conquer Damascus himself. And so as autumn began to turn to winter, Suluk Khan gathered his forces and informed them that they were not, in fact, going to stay in Khutal over the winter. They would instead regroup, cross the river, and deal a death blow to the Arab army now in Balkh. Through November, Suluk had gathered his forces and the forces of his Sogdian and Bactrian allies and prepared for what he hoped to be the beginning of a grand invasion. Holed up in Balkh, Asad believed that there was no way that Suluk would attack in the winter. Perhaps if he had had more experience fighting steppe troops, he would have known better. Additionally, the Khorasani Arabs who did know that winter was no impediments to the armies of the steppes were only in small numbers and in low positions in Asad's largely Syrian army. So Asad demobilized his men. So dispersed and disorganized were his forces that when he ordered a commander to gather a mere 50 men to hold a crucial bridge in the autumn, the commander responded to him incredulously, "From where can I get 50 men?" But then, on the 7th of December, 737, news came to Asad that the father of the fight had returned. Suluk had crossed the river and come to the fortress of Jaza with a great army of Turks, Sogdians, and Bactrians, at least 30,000 strong, and with them was Al-Harith and his men. Asad began to prepare desperately. He dashed off orders to his troops to return, promising them 20 dirhams each just for showing up. So desperate was Asad that he even called upon the Khorasani Arabs, hated by the Syrian Arabs and feared by Asad, as supporters of Al-Harith's message. Indeed, the level of hatred and mistrust between the Khorasani and Syrian Arabs shows just how deep the tensions between the frontier and the Umayyad center had become. And as we will discuss next time, this was a dark omen for the fading Umayyad Caliphate. Surprisingly, Asad was able to cobble together a small force of around 7,000 men, but the Arabs were now outnumbered more than 3-1 by the Türgesh and their allies. Still, this was more than Suluk had expected. Al-Harith had assured him that the Arabs always demobilized in the winter, and there was no possibility that they would be able to resist the might of the Turks. And so Suluk had dispersed his men to search for supplies so that his troops would be ready for the long campaign ahead of them. But then, while camped near the village of Kharistan, Suluk looked up and saw a cloud of dust arising from the direction of Balkh. He called Al-Harith to him and said, "Did you not claim that Asad would not come out to resist? But this dust cloud has come from the direction of Balkh." Then Suluk sent out scouts, saying, "Look whether you see a raised seat or chair on the camels." When the scouts came back, they told them that they had seen these things with their own eyes. And so Suluk said, "Brigands do not carry raised seats and chairs. This is Asad who has come out against us." And indeed, it was Asad. He had managed to defeat a small Türgesh party conducting reconnaissance and searching for provisions, and captured several Türgesh prisoners. Upon learning from them that the Khan's army was so dispersed, Asad decided that his only hope to beat the much larger Turkish army was to strike now. And so he had rushed his army out to face the father of the fight at this moment of weakness. And now he was bearing down on Suluk. Suluk hastily assembled what troops he could, a mere 4,000 men of his 30,000 strong army. On the right wing, he placed Al-Harith's men and his Sogdian and Bactrian allies, under the leadership of Al-Harith. On his left wing, he placed his own Turkish troops, led by his Yabgu, Kulchor. Suluk rode up and down the line, imploring his troops to fight, to charge. With a great tremor, the air filled with the sounds of hooves, the unsheathing of swords, the twang of bows, Turkish war screams, the sounds of Sogdian drums, even cries of Allahu Akbar from Al-Harith's Arab troops. Suluk's army rushed forward towards the Arab lines. The fight was vicious, and Suluk's troops seemed to be winning at first. The Turkish troops on the left inflicted heavy casualties, breaking through the front lines of the Arabs. Al-Harith and the Sogdians, Bactrians, and Arabs had even more success on the right. Reportedly, Al-Harith's wing advanced so far that Al-Harith himself managed to capture Assad's tent. But the day was not for the father of the fight. As the battle hung in the balance, Assad launched a vicious counterattack from the rear, overwhelming the Türgesh forces. Suluk's armies were beaten back. For the first time since he was a junior commander at the Battle of Bolchu with the Second Khanate decades earlier, his forces broke and began a chaotic rout. Suluk saw the battle turning, saw himself unbelievably losing. As the Arab forces surged forward, he knew the horrifying truth. The battle was lost. He turned and fled with Al-Harith and what troops he could extract. Al-Tabari reports, the Khan turned away in flight, the Muslims taking possession of the Turks' camp. The Turks left behind their pots still boiling, and women, including some Arab and Mawali women, and some Turkish women. The Khan's horse sank into the mire with him, but Al-Harith protected him. The Muslims did not know that it was the Khan. The Turks' camp was found crammed with every kind of silver vessel, and with Turkish women who played cymbals. Assad sent the Turkish slave girls to the Iranian lords of Khorasan, and rescued those of the Muslims who were in their hands. The Battle of Kharistan, though little more than a skirmish of a couple thousand troops on each side, proved to be both a miracle for the Arabs and a total catastrophe for Suluk. On the Arab side, when the Caliph Hisham heard the news, he could not believe that Assad had actually been victorious over Suluk. In the words of Al-Tabari, Hisham had been reclining on his side, but sat straight up at the mention of the Khan's camp. He said 3 times, "You plundered the Khan's camp?" The Caliph, who had seriously been considering removing Assad, was convinced to keep him on as governor in Khorasan. The Arab position south of the river Oxus, the Amudarya, was now completely secured. But as we will see next time, internal tension still racked the Caliphate under the surface. Meanwhile, on the Türgesh side, the loss of his camp and all of the booty that had been captured in Khutal, as well as the news of his defeat, severely undermined Suluk's authority, both among his Sogdian vassals and among his Turkish followers. And remember, Suluk's authority had already been on shaky ground due to the resentment at his new innovative military salary system and his defeat at the hands of the Tang. Very quickly, the wolves began to circle. And so Suluk fled with Al-Harith and his troops back to the Türgesh heartlands as a severely weakened Khan. The revenues from conquest dried up, and he was no longer able to pay out the fixed salaries to his troops. His innovative and deeply hated new salary system fell apart immediately. This led to defections and revolts among his men. As the Book of Tang says, his subjects began to defect from him. As Suluk weakened, as the plunder from conquest disappeared, tensions escalated between the Black Türgesh and the Yellow Türgesh. As so often happens to Turkish steppe confederations, amid mutual recriminations, the Türgesh state began to descend into division and violence between the two main factions, and Suluk was now powerless to stop it. As the walls began to close in around Suluk, his Yabgu, Kulchor, who was his own relative and a key leader of the Black Türgesh, began to conspire with the Tang to remove Suluk Khan. The end came ignominiously for Suluk in 738, when, with Tang approval, Kulchor assassinated Suluk Khan, falling on him at night with a gang of his supporters and stabbing him to death. Kulchor then proclaimed himself Khan. As we will cover in a later episode, this really kicked off a civil war within the Türgesh Khanate. Shocking, I know. Thus passed Suluk Khan, Abu Muzahim, the father of the fight. Suluk was really the last great pre-Islamic Turkish leader. He was clearly a brilliant general and a cunning tactician. From the Day of Thirst through the Battle of the Baggage, he led his troops to phenomenal and stunning victories against the largest and most powerful state in the world, the almost invincible Umayyad Caliphate. And despite his eventual defeat at Beshbaluk, for years he was more than a match for the Tang, the other great superpower of the age. Suluk was ultimately brought down by what amounted to a minor skirmish. But his state was so unstable due to decisions that he had made, his innovative salary system and losing a war with Tang China that he started, that even a minor loss doomed him. On some level, His innovative new salary system was almost too much of an innovation. Suluk had only made this one change, but he hadn't done the rest of the work required to support such a system, namely build a centralized state. The Türgesh Khanate under his rule remained essentially a classic steppe confederation, not a state with a sophisticated bureaucracy and a system of organization that could actually make the salary idea work. So his reform actually ended up destabilizing his position, and as soon as the victory stopped, Suluk's end was merely a matter of time. Nevertheless, for almost 20 years, he waged a war of almost unimaginable success against the greatest military power of his day. Indeed, I find it somewhat puzzling that Suluk's story is not more well known. If we look to the west, his contemporary Charles Martel is world famous for defeating the Umayyads in what in essence amounted to nothing more than a large raid of France, so unimportant to the Umayyads at the time that contemporary Islamic sources don't even record it. But Suluk inflicted defeat after crushing defeat on the military superpower of his day, defeats so total and so terrifying that they kept multiple caliphs in Damascus up at night, and gallons of ink were expended by Muslim historians in recording them and trying to explain them away. And his war with the Umayyads ultimately, and unintentionally, led to the very fall of the Caliphate. In response to the victories of Suluk Khan, the Umayyads were forced to move massive numbers of Syrian and Iraqi troops into Khorasan, massively destabilizing the frontier region, which directly led to the revolt of al-Harith and his successors. It may be cold comfort for Suluk, but he ultimately did, in his own way, set about the chain of events that after his death would ultimately lead to the destruction of his greatest enemy. The news of the death of Suluk Khan, the father of the fight, caused a sensation in the Umayyad realms. In the court of Damascus, the Arab poet Ibn al-Sajif al-Majishi composed a poem in honor of the defeat of the father of the fight, saying in part, "The Khan did not escape him except by running. There had broken up of his multitudes that which had been broken up. O al-Harith, you have found bitter herbs." But the bitter herbs found by al-Harith would ultimately poison not al-Harith, but the Umayyad state, because the fall of Suluk was far from the end for al-Harith in the movement that he had started. So next time, we will discuss the end of the Umayyads, as, in the aftermath of the fall of the father of the fight, the eastern frontier of the Caliphate rises up in revolution.